In this tutorial, everything is about trees. We are going to create a geometry node tree and a shader tree, and by combining them, we will create a setup so powerful that will allow you to make anime-style trees and bushes of your choice. And the best part about this tutorial is that even if you never touched geometry nodes or shader nodes, at the end of it, you will be able to make your own anime-style foliage using the simplest geometry. You only need to make a rough shape of what you want your foliage to be, and Blender does the rest. I will try my best to explain every step of the way, as well as answer why we are doing what we are doing as we go along. I am working with Blender version 3.6. So if you want to maximize your chances of successfully following this tutorial, I recommend you use the same or newer Blender version. Also, let's be honest, life is kind of pay to win. So if you want to have the project without spending the time to follow the tutorial, you can get this blend file directly from my Gumroad, link in the description. So here we are in a fresh Blender scene, as I said version 3.6, and we will start by deleting everything, and we create one object that will hold our geometry nodes tree. You can choose anything you like, but I will go with a UV sphere. Now let's go to the upper left corner, and when you have this icon, we can drag it into the middle to create another screen. And here we want to have the geometry node editor. So let's click that, and with our sphere selected, let's click new to create new geometry nodes. Now we can click N to hide this ribbon, and the workflow is actually very simple. The geometry nodes is not gonna be scary, so don't worry about it. So the first thing we want to do is we want to turn our sphere into a volume. So with Ctrl A, we want to look for mesh, then operations, and mesh to volume. And with this node, we turn our mesh into a volume. Now what we want to do is we want to scatter a bunch of points inside this volume that will be the base for our bushes. So with Ctrl 8, let's go to point and then distribute points in volume and plug it right after. And now we have some points. We can increase the density of those points so we have a little bit more to work with. And now that we have a bunch of points, we want to turn them back into a mesh. But we cannot do this directly. First, we have to turn the points into a volume again. So again, we click Shift A to add a node. Or if you want, we can click spacebar and then search for the node directly in here. And the node we are looking for is called points to volume. And we connect it right after. And now we have also a volume, but a little bit more interesting than the original shape that we had. And since we actually want to have a mesh that we can see in the camera later, we want to turn this volume into a mesh. So the next node is gonna be volume to mesh. And let's plug this right after. And this is gonna be the base for our all foliage, whether it's bushes or trees. And now to finish up with our geometry nodes, we need two extra nodes. One is set shade smooth, which is gonna get rid of this faceted look that we had before. And the next one is set material, because we want to have control over how our foliage, our bushes is gonna look like. And this is the core of the geometry nodes that we will need. Of course, we will come back to this later to make some adjustments and add some variations and improve overall look. But this is the main setup that is gonna get us everywhere. And the next thing we want to take care of is the material. So we want to drag another window, but this time horizontally. So we have geometry nodes on the bottom, and the top window we can change to shader editor. Then we can click new to create new material. Let's give it a proper name. Anime bushes. It's very important because later we will go back to geometry nodes, and in the set material node, we want to make sure that the correct material is assigned here, because that's what's gonna be visible on the mesh later. So with that done, we can already go into the rendered preview to see what we are working with. And as you see now, nothing is happening because we have the principled BSDF and there is no light on the scene. So first of all, let's click Shift A and create a light. We can use a sunlight, it doesn't really matter. We just want some sort of light source in order to see better what we are actually doing. And we can also give it some random rotation. And now back to our object. We can delete the principled BSDF because we don't really need it. And instead what we want is diffuse BSDF. It's much simpler and it doesn't have as many options and we won't use them anyway, so why bother? Now we can drag from this green point out in the void and we can look for shader to RGB. Now, very important, this node only works when you have the render engine set to Eevee. It does not work in cycles, so this whole setup is best suited for real-time scenes using Eevee render engine. And now this is the simplest technique that you can make cell shaded effect in Blender in general. Simply from color, you drag out and you look for color ramp. And here you use those sliders, you can add new ones, and we can connect this directly into the output surface. And this color ramp slider is gonna dictate how our object is gonna look like. So first of all, because we are going for this anime look, we want to change the interpolation from linear to constant. And as you can see, everything went black. But what we have now is very contrasty look, because as we drag this slider down, you can see that more and more of the mesh is being uncovered. And the way it works is it simply takes the light source, it gets our light information for the object, and only based on that, it splatters the color onto the object. Now we are making bushes, so black and white is not the best color scheme. So we can simply click on the color stop and then on this black value, and then we can choose the color that suits us best. Since we are going for bushes, I think something greenish and a bit darker is quite suitable. And then we can click on the next color stop. We can actually delete it and click plus to add another one, so we know it's the same color, and we can simply shift it a little bit lighter. And maybe we can give it a bit more saturation as well. And then again, plus, move it over, and again, lighter, and maybe more saturation. If you have hard time seeing what's happening in here, you can always move those closer, and then you should see the areas that they affect. Since we are going for anime style look, I wouldn't recommend using more color stops than maybe 4. So this one is gonna be like really, really bright and maybe going into yellow. Let's see how that looks like. So that's like the highest highlight on the mesh. And I think this color scheme looks alright. I mean, the bush is not yet impressive because we still have some details that we are missing. But now you understand what is the color scheme and how you can adjust it. So now we can again leave the shader nodes as they are. We won't touch them for now. We'll go back to them later. And now let's go back to our geometry nodes and see whether we can push a little bit further in the geometry nodes. So first thing that we can do is we can sort of give ourselves an option to scatter the blobs of our bush to make it a little bit more interesting and give us control over it. So in our tree, let's look for distribute points in volume and move it a little bit to the left so we have more space in before points to volume node. And in between, we want to put a set position node, just like that. And what this will do is it will let us offset the blobs by a different amount for different blobs. So in order to randomize it, we will need a noise texture. Simply look for noise texture, and we could actually connect directly color into the offset. And then you can see it's moving. And if you play with the scale, it's randomizing it. But at the same time, I don't know if you noticed, the whole thing sort of shifted. If I break the connection, it's going to the middle of the scene. And if I connect it, it sort of escapes into this corner of the screen. And that is because noise texture gives us values from 0 to 1. And ideally, what we want is we want our object to stay in one place, and we want to scatter them from the inside. So we want to change this range from 0 to 1 into -5 to 0.5. So what we will do is we will look for vector math nodes, plug it right after, and change the mode from add to subtract, and subtract 0.5 on all 3 axes. In order to change all of them, you just click and drag, and then you can edit all of them instead of one by one. And now, as you can see, our mesh sits back in the middle of the scene. The noise texture, we have some parameters like scale or detail, roughness, which doesn't do that much. But if we want to have control over how far they are scattering apart from the middle, we will need another vector math node. So we can simply select this, Shift D to duplicate it, and then plug it right after. And then change from subtract to scale. And this single value is gonna control how far are those blobs gonna get scattered. And you can see that now the scale of the noise texture is gonna make so much more difference if we change it. So as you can see, now we have a control over the scale of the noise as well as how far from the center it goes. I wouldn't go too crazy, maybe something like 3 or 4 should be fine. So with this done, you can click Ctrl J and put it in the frame so that you know these are the values to adjust later. And we can move on to the next interesting node in our node tree, and that is point to volume. As you can see, we have this value radius right here, which is now set to 0.5. And as we increase it or decrease it, the blobs increase and decrease in size. But as you can see, they are increasing and decreasing uniformly. So every blob is increasing and decreasing at the same time. But what we can do is we can put a little bit more variation into that and make blobs of different sizes. So again, let's move these nodes a little bit to the side so we have some space to work with. And then we can drag from this radius node and look for random value. Now it should give you the random value node and it should be set to float by default. But if for some reason it's not, make sure it is. And now the min and max is simply the minimum size of the blob and also the maximum size of the blob. So you can set it to something like, I don't know, 0.2 to 0.4 or 5. And then you have, you know, a little bit of the bigger ones and the smaller ones. And you can see it better if we spread them apart. You can clearly see that this blob is bigger than this blob. So it all creates those nice light variations that we can see later on our mesh. Let's keep it closer together again. Oh, and by the way, if you don't like the distribution of blobs, but you don't want to change like the spread of them or anything else, you just want them to be distributed differently, there is always those seed values in some of the nodes. Like for example, distribute points in volume has a seed value. This value is basically the randomization of how the object is created. So if you want to have a different result, you just scroll the seed value and you have stuff that has the same parameters, but just the points are distributed in different way, which gives you completely different results. So you can just, you know, look for something that works for you. Maybe something like this. And the same goes to the random value. We can change how the size of the blob is distributed across all of the blobs. So I will leave it something like this. And now let's get to, I think, the most important part of this tutorial. And that is populating this blobby shape with details. And we can simply do that by inserting set position again after volume to mesh node. So again, spacebar, set position, and just put it right here. And same as before, we're gonna use noise texture and two vector maths. So we can simply select all those three nodes, Shift D to duplicate them, and then Ctrl J again to create a separate frame so that they are not together. We can move them over. And now when we connect the scale into offset, you can see that, well, everything looks like it's screwed up, but don't worry about it. This is exactly what we want. So first of all, let's bring the scale to 1. So we have a little bit less of a mess. And then let's take the noise texture and bring its scale also to 1. Now, as you can see, something is already happening, but what we want is we want a bit more rougher details. So we bring the detail all the way up to something like maybe 7. Then also let's pump the roughness a bit more, maybe like 0.8. And you can see something starts happening. And on top of this, we can also increase the distortion to maybe something like 1. And this is already something we can start to work with. Now, I encourage you, take this noise texture and just try what works for you. You know, increase or decrease the scale. Do any kinds of stuff you want with those values, because those are the ones that sort of define how the bush looks like. From the distance, you can see that it already starts to look, I would say, quite nice for the amount of work that we put in. By the way, just like bushes, you know, humans need water, so make sure to stay hydrated. And we can continue. So now that we have the details all over the mesh, we maybe don't want it to be all over so uniformly. So if we want our details to be only on some part of the blobs, but not all of them, maybe we like the smooth surface more, we can take advantage of this set position input, which is selection, and just drag it out and look for random value, just like before. And this time it should be set to Boolean instead of float. And this is where we control how much of a mesh is covered into this fine detail that comes from the noise texture. So if we set it to 1, everything is gonna be covered, and 0, everything is clean. I like to keep it at something like 0.3, so we have the areas with high detail, but areas with smooth surface as well, and then it sort of blends together really nicely. And then if we want those details to be a bit more higher frequency, I would say, we can increase the scale of this noise texture. But then again, if this is not noisy enough for you, then there is a fix for that as well. Don't worry about it. We have to go back to our points to volume node. And as you can see right now, the resolution is set to amount. And this is fine if you're working with a small mesh. But let me show you something. If I go into edit mode and I have my sphere and I take those points and I drag them really far from the center of the object, you can see that we are really fast losing the details on our bushes. And I mean, that's not as advertised. I want to have the hedges that just stretch for this distance, but this one doesn't look like hedges. So in order to fix that, we have to take this points to volume node and change the resolution from amount into size. And that will control the resolution no matter the size of the object. And that is the voxel size value right here. Now, I would be very careful because this is very, very delicate process. I would not put it as lower than 0.05, for example, because then your computer can get very laggy very fast. I mean, it depends what kind of computer you have, but just be careful. Like, don't use the slider with your mouse because you can easily crash your Blender. And as you can see now, we not only have nice resolution across the whole area, but also it looks so much crisper. We have way more details than we had before. So this voxel size is really what controls the amount of noisiness or like the fine details that you have on the mesh. If I set it to 0.1, you can see that we still have some. It depends what style are you going for. It's still usable, but I sort of like this more noisy result. And I mean, right now, as you can see, we have blobs everywhere and it doesn't really look like bushes or something. So if you remember from before, we can either increase the size of each single blob and this way make it more thick, or we can simply go back to the density of the points in volume and increase this value. Maybe like 50. And then it already looks much better. We can also help it a little bit with the size. And I think this is really fine looking anime style bush. Now, before we wrap this up, there is still a small thing that I want to show you in the shader graph that can improve this so much more, especially if you have more than one object on the scene. But as far as geometry nodes, this is literally all the setup that you need for this to work. Now you can take this and tweak all those values that you can see and create something amazing with it. And by the way, if you do, now we have Discord. So link is in the description. I would love to see your work. And if you have any problem, we have a help channel as well. So feel free to check it out. And now for the last part in the shader editor, as you can see, the graph doesn't look very impressive. So we can improve it a little bit. Let's first move this shader to RGB a little bit further so we have some space to work with. And now let's get a texture coordinates node, which is going to be very helpful for us, as well as a separate XYZ node. And we can connect the texture coordinate normal into separate XYZ. Now, if you don't know what normal is, we can actually preview this to give you an example of what I'm talking about. If we preview the normal, you can see that we have this gradient of lights coming from different directions. And in here, we have separate XYZ, where we separate it by the directions. So if we choose X, for example, we have the gradient coming on the X axis, same with Y and Z. And Z is what we are actually interested in, because we can take this and we can mix it with the results that we already have and get rid of those big areas of very uniform darkest color, because as you can see, the light shines from this direction. So obviously this is the part of the shadow, but we can help it a little bit and make it just a tad more interesting with the separate XYZ. So in order to mix it, we will need a mix color node, and we plug the shader to RGB color to the A, and then separate XYZ Z value to the B of this mix color. Now we change the mode from mix to multiply, and we can preview that as well to give you a visual of what I'm talking about. As you can see, if I bring the factor all the way down, now this is only the light information that we get from our light source. But if we mix in the normal Z, we have these gray values, even here in the complete shadow, which gives this impression of light going through the bush, even though in the scene it's actually a solid object. So if we now take this result and plug it into the color ramp instead, and then we can preview the color ramp, you can see that, well, nothing really happened, but that is because this color ramp has very tight values. So we can take this one and just bring it a little bit closer, like almost touching the last one. And you can see we have this light poking through. Now we can better adjust the other values as well. So we have more areas which are being highlighted. And then this very top, only those like very top parts of the bushes are getting this nice yellowish sunny highlight. We can also rotate the light. And well, you tell me what you think, whether it's an improvement or not. This is how it looks like with this trick. And this is how it looks like without it. I think it's definitely an improvement. And now imagine that you have a scene, right? And you just want to have nice hedges or trees or something like that. So let's click Shift A and add a, let's say cube. Cube is fine. Then we go to the modifiers, we check for geometry nodes, and then we are choosing the one that we were just working with. And as you can see, you already have this sort of nice blobby, let's say tree. We can click here so that in edit mode we won't see the foliage. And then while we edit this, we can take the top and maybe make it in this cone shape like this, which should give us a little bit more tree-like shape. But then if you take this and, for example, you duplicate it a couple of times, you can sort of see that not only the trees look exactly the same in terms of the distribution of the blobs, but also the color is literally the same. So it just looks like obvious copies. And luckily there is the easiest fix for that. We simply go back to our geometry nodes. And now you have this group input, this first node in the tree, and you see there is this empty output. This is how we can make these variations per object. We don't even have to touch this one. We can simply copy this, Shift D, and then move it into the node distribute points in volume, and we can plug it into the seed. And this way, each object is gonna have their own seed. So we can select this geometry node is gonna look like this one is like this, and for every single object you can have a different kind of seed. And this goes to literally every value in the geometry nodes. So if you want to have a different sort of spread of blobs, all you have to do is take this input, copy it in here, because we remember that this value is what controls the spread. Oh, it's getting a little bit laggy with my computer, so I'll have to be careful. And you just connect the empty one into the scale. And now in your modifier tab, you will have another value that you can change per object. So one value doesn't necessarily mean that everything else is gonna be affected. And so if you wish so, you can take this group input and go through all these geometry nodes and just create however options you want to have in your geometry nodes. In the blend file that you've seen at the beginning, the one on my Gumroad, I have set up a few controls over here so it's easier to manipulate, but it doesn't have to be like this. You are in control here, so feel free to adjust it to whatever you want. And now, okay, the shape is different, so yeah, I understand. But hey, I mean the color is still the same. If we put it closer, or if we want to make, I don't know, a forest or something like this, we can see that the color is sort of blending in together, and then we just have one big blob of objects. And it doesn't have to be the case. So all we actually have to do is, in the material editor, let's look for our anime bushes material, and then let's look for object info. And in here, you see we have this random output, and that is giving us a random value between 0 and 1 based on the object. So as you can see, some are brighter, some are darker, and we can use it to our advantage because we can get a hue saturation node and then run our color ramp through it. And then as you can see, the hue and saturation is what we can get our variations from. But we don't want our variations to be drastic, because if we connect the random to saturation, for example, as it is, you can see that the differences are wild. Same if we go with, for example, hue. So what we want to do is we want to have this random value, but we want to curb it into just a little bit of variation. So the best way to do this is we drag it out and we look for color ramp again. There are other ways, but I feel like color ramp is the most visual. And then the lowest value from this random that we want to get is, let's see, we have saturation 1 and this is like that. Saturation 0.9 is slightly washed out and saturation 1.1 is still nice to look at. It's not overblown like, for example, this one. So we know that we want the range for the saturation to be between 0.9 and 1.1. And this is what we set the values in here. We click on the lowest value and we want it to be value, not saturation, because we only want the black and white values to be between this range. 0.9, it's pretty bright. And then the next value is gonna be, of course, white again, because the value 1.1 is going beyond the 0 to 1 range, which you usually have with the color ramp. But now if you plug the color into the saturation, you can see that we only have the values between 0.9 and 1.1. Maybe actually the difference is too big, so I should probably put it between 1 and 1.1. And now I think it's a little bit better. And we can do the same thing with value, so we have brighter or darker, or with hue, so we have a slightly different hues of the color. So we can simply duplicate this color ramp, connect it again from random, and then you see the hue 0.5 is the default. If we go one step higher, it's a little bit too much, so maybe 0.53. So let's put 0.53 on the top end, and 0.47 on the lower end. And now if we connect this to the hue, you can see we have slightly different variations depending on the object. And if you duplicate those trees and get new ones, they will automatically get different hues and saturations as they go along. Now, whenever you want to create a bush, you simply create whatever mesh you want. It could be even as simple as plain. Then you edit however you want the bush to look like. For example, I want it to be maybe in this shape. Then I want our hedges to be, let's say, this tall. So let's make it like that. And then simply take the modifier geometry nodes and look for the setup that we just created. And that is gonna instantly create the anime looking bushes in the same style as all the other foliage that you have on your scene. Now that's all I have for you today, and I can't wait to see what you come up with using this setup. You can share with me either on Twitter or Discord, and I'll see you in the next one.